Dawn came thin and bladed as a drawn knife, scoring pale light across the frost-stiffened grasses of the Winterfell plain. Breath hung in drifts that broke and curled as men moved through them, carrying spears and the quiet weight of sleep's last false comforts. He could hear the creak of leather, the click of buckles, the rasp of a whetstone, the mare's low cough as she stamped and tossed her head in the bite morning. The world seemed to hold its inhale along with them. Jon stood and let it cut his cheeks. The cold, the clean smell of snow sharpened by the smoke of 100 cookfires no one had the appetite to visit. Winterfell's ramparts were dark against a lightning sky, and upon their gray were new banners, flayed men rippling, skins pink made dull by frost. The heart trees behind those walls slept in the gods' wood, but he knew their pale faces, remembered bark like carved bone. He had knelt beneath them and sworn what he could swear, or else simply warmed himself in the knowledge that someone would witness what must be done, even if there were no words for it. "You're ready," Sansa said, and it was not a question. She had a voice fit for courts now, cool, steady, a winter brook running under ice. But the thread inside it was still Sansa of Winterfell, the girl who had held his arm when she was small and shied at thunder. The primrose in her gone, its sweetness stripped. Iron remained, tempered. He turned. The hood of her cloak had fallen back, and red gold hair lay braided along her shoulder beneath a sable that would have dwarfed her once. Foxes, wolves, the world had placed every name upon her and none of them wrong. "We're as ready as we can be," he said. His mouth felt like it was full of old snow. Behind her, Davos watched the dawning field with the exact patience of a man who had seen too many mornings that might have been his last. The old knight's hands were clasped in front of him, thumbs rubbing, some prayer without a name. Tormund Giantsbane rolled one shoulder and spat thoughtfully into the frost. A man who belonged to no hall and no rule but the one where strength and luck did battle, and the stronger one was rarely the one you expected. "You know what he is," Sansa said. "You know what he wants." "I know," Jon said. He could still see the letter, its threat penned in an unsteady, gleeful hand, like a boy's. "Bring me my bride. Bring me the bastard. Bring me my broken things to break again." Rickon's name had not been in that letter, but it had been carved into the air around each line as surely as if a knife had written it. "Do not let him turn you into what he knows how to use," Sansa said, half to him and half to herself. "Anger is a bridle he made." Jon met her eyes. "I won't give him mine." They were quiet a moment. The field beyond their tents was a spread of white and gray and shadow, their lines set in ragged patches of wildlings and black-clad men of no oaths left, scattered among the thin banners of those northern houses who had answered wolves with wolves. The Karstarks and the Umbers had not. He saw the ragged edge of the giants, the single giant, really one breathing like a bellows, a cloud blooming with every exhale. The giant had sat much of the night, watching the dark with the stillness of a boulder. He had bled for a dozen of Jon's rash vows already. Jon could not ask him for a 13th unless that vow mattered. "Sansa," he said softly, "tell me again." She nodded once. "They are here. They rode in the night and wait to the southeast beyond the ridge. Lord Royce brought them with Lord Baelish. I do not want him thanked for it, but we will use what's offered. They keep their banners low in the hollow. They will not commit until I bid them." "You should have told me before," he said. Not accusation, weariness, a line of regret folded inside the words. "I should have. I tell you now," she answered. She studied Winterfell's walls. "He thinks he has us measured. He thinks he holds the last Stark child in his hand like a beetle, and that he may pinch whenever he needs a better sound from you." She looked back at Jon. The line of her mouth was small, determined. "Make him measure again. Make him measure wrong." He let breath out. If relief lived in him at the thought of unexpected mailed men behind that ridge, it lived with its brother, the knowledge of who had delivered them. This too was a bargain, a debt scrawled and signed in his absence. Little finger. Every gift the man gave came wrapped in a chain. "Parley," Jon said. Davos lifted his head. "Under a flag and witnessed. If he has any notion of the old ways, he'll come." His voice was gentle. But that is a word men like him take as rope, to pull at until it frays. We force it, Jon said. How? Tormund demanded, though the question had the shape of approval inside it. He liked a plan that called itself a challenge. By dragging his shame into the light, Jon said, and he surprised himself at the brutality of the phrase. He hadn't meant to use a knife like that. We demand he bring Rickon to prove he's alive. We demand he stand before the North and answer for what he has done and what he plans to do. He looked at Sansa. We ask for what he will refuse, and we ask it loudly enough that men on both sides hear it. And when he laughs, Tormund's voice had gone as flat as the plain. Then we make a trade, Jon said, and Sansa's attention sharpened like a hawk's head tilting. Don't you dare, she said. Don't even put the thought together. Me for Rickon, Jon said. I wear a chain willingly and walk under his banner into his walls with a rope around my wrists. He gives the boy at once into your hands and Davos's. The lords watching will remember that. They'll tell men at their fires, and those men will tell others. If he breaks it before them all. Men forget, Sansa said. Fear makes them forget quicker. I know. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Boo. If Rickon dies on that field before the first arrow flies, the thing that breaks will be me. I know what he wants me to do. I will not chase a boy across open ground again. I would not survive the running. Her eyes shuddered, a winter-white blink. When she opened them, they were not softer, but they saw him. If you do this, she said, slow and clear, like cutting strips of cloth so there was no waste, you do it for him, not to make a story for any lord. A story is a veil. We need a blade. For him, Jon said. There is no other reason. And if he refuses? Davos asked. Then we fight, and every man who stood close to witness will take to his grave that Ramsay Snow would not trade a man for a boy. That may matter in the next hour or in the hours after. He looked past their faces towards Winterfell again. Raise a white cloth. We'll ride at first light with a handful. Sansa, come. He will take too much pleasure from me alone. He saw the very small curl at the corner of Tormund's mouth against his beard. Approval cut like a nick in leather. Davos's lids lowered and lifted once. A man not praying but taking measure of a weight before he slid it onto his shoulder. Bring one near, Jon added, and Davos grunted. The gods love a good piece of theater, Davos muttered. If they're the kind of gods who watch this sort of thing. They are the only kind left, Sansa said. They rode in today while the frost still held to the grass edges. A white square of cloth hung from a lance. Jon felt the horse's power bunch and loosen beneath him and thought about the language of animals. How you told something what it was to do and it listened or did not. Ramsay rode out with 6. He rode like a boy playing at war, casual and competent both. Seat easy. Little jolt of heel to keep his mount's ears forward. He was dressed in a dark leather that swallowed light. His cloak furred so thick you could have slept on it. The smile on his mouth was a coin with a face cut deep and false. He brought the Karstark heir with him, hard-eyed, hungry-mouthed, and the Umbers. Small Jon Umber was a cliff face of a man, beard like a bloody bear's. His father's laughter dug into the lines around his eyes and left to rot. Jon knew that laughter. He'd heard it in hall and field when he was younger and wanted it like he wanted his father's hand upon his head. To see it on a man who had put his name beside Bolton's hurt like a poorly healed wound. The kind that aches when snow comes. The other faces were hard to look at. The old Maester Wolkan came, too, as if to lend some brittle thread of law to the whole farce. His hands tight on his reins, eyes wide and watery. Behind them, on a short lead like an animal, Rickon Stark walked, hands bound in front of him with a loop of rope that made his wrists raw. He had grown heavy-boned over the years, no longer a child, not yet a man, but his face, dark with grime, was Rickon's, the same quick, fierce look in his eyes he'd had even as a small boy. Bran, Robb, Arya each had had some echo of their mother or father in them easy to name. Rickon had always been most stark to Jon's eye, in that he seemed built not for court or war but for Winterfell itself. Jon's stomach went cold as the frost. The rope cut. The rope burned. Jon's hand flexed on the reins as if each tendon answered the rope's pull. Ramsay's smile widened, as if he could taste that reaction like salt on his tongue. "Brother," he called in a voice the field could hear. "Look, I found a dog that comes when it's called." Sansa's horse sidestepped. She brought him to quiet with a knee, her eyes never leaving Ramsay's. "Bastard," she said conversationally, as if naming a bird. The word landed precisely and without heat. He looked at her then, and what moved under the surface of his face was some deep, thoughtless delight. "Wife," he said, and the word crawled. "You look well. I wonder if you slept." Sansa did not blink. "Release my brother," she said. "If you refuse, there will be no parley. Only witnesses to your cowardice before both our lines." Ramsay's eyes flicked to one, who loomed behind Jon like a storm cloud. A ripple went through Ramsay's riders. A check in breath, shoulders tightening. No matter which lord they called and what debts had driven them to this. Even Smalljon's big hand slid a half-inch on his hilt before he realized it had moved. Jon kept his eyes on Ramsay but pitched his voice to fold in the men at his back and the lords across. "Rickon is the rightful lord of Winterfell. He is a child, not a weapon. He is Stark. You stole him under false friendship. You did not win him by honor. Give him back now and answer for your other crimes by the sword if you want a song sung of it." A few horses shifted. The lord's retainers behind gave those small nothings that pass for talk among men who will not call out openly. Clearing of throat, a thing dropped, picked. The plain was full of listening. Ramsay leaned forward a fraction, hands light on his saddlebow. "A child," he repeated, as if tasting the shape of the word to see if there was marrow to be sucked. "Look at him. He does not look to me like a lord. He looks like a little wolf cub that hasn't learned dogs eat meat." He tilted his head. "Trade games, Snow? If you desired him back so dearly, you might have brought me something more tempting than a speech." Jon looked away from Ramsay at the Umbers then, very deliberately, to find Smalljon's eyes. "Your father tore an iron hand from a kingslayer in a wedding hall," he said. "Whatever else he was, he kept his oath to my brother while he breathed. Will you answer the old gods and the green moods of this land with a rope around a Stark boy's wrists? Will that be the story men tell over your bones?" Smalljon scowled as if he'd bitten something sour and too small to spit. "My father burned for Robb Stark and ate salt at the twins," he said roughly. "Songs matter little when you're a bones heap. Yo! You want him? Take him. Come through us and take him. Or," Jon said, "you could step out of the path of a dead man, Smalljon." He looked again at Ramsay. "I demand Rickon. Failing that, I pledge myself as hostage." He heard Sansa's breath catch and let his own ride steady over it. "I will go into Winterfell under your guard and your chains. You will give me my brother now into the hands of my people at once. If one hair on his head is harmed hereafter, every man who hears what was said today will know which terms were offered and which were refused." There was silence of a particular kind, the silence of a dog that has not decided whether to leap or to lie down. Ramsay's eyes gleamed with reflection of something inside himself. He had wanted to make Jon come like a hound when he whistled, to wag to him across the killing field. That moment had been meant to be his. But here was another, perhaps sweeter. The bastard brother offering his own wrists to him in front of Winterfell and gods and men. He had never been fond of rules, but he adored the moment when he broke them and someone watched. "You would put your head in my kennel?" Ramsay said, soft. "What would you choke on first? I wonder, the rope or your pride? If he gives you a noose, he'll put it around his own neck later," Davos said at Jon's shoulder, voice pitched not to carry to Ramsay but to carve into Jon's spine. "Make him swear before the trees and the men. Make him call the old gods, name them on his tongue. Even liars get burned by vows when they lay their hands to the same wood as their fathers." "If they had fathers," Tormund said dourly. Jon raised his hands, open, unclenching them from reins. "I will come forward on foot," he called, "and you will send Rickon forward on foot at the same pace. We cross between our lines where both can see. If any arrow flies, If any man moves with weapon drawn towards the boy, then let your own men call you an oathbreaker for all the years you live." He kept his voice calm. "There is a weirwood at the edge of the old campground. We can do it there under witness." Ramsay made a little show of thinking, the way a cat sits very still before putting a paw through a cage. He glanced at Karstark, who smiled with his teeth and lifted one shoulder as if to say, "Why not?" He looked at Small John, who stared back, weighing not honor but profit. Ramsay was not a lord of the north by blood. He was a man with knives and a house he'd taken by terror. He did not love any god, but he did love games played beside them. "Very well," he said lightly. "We'll walk. I'll leash one wolf to loose another. Come then, Snow." He took the rope from Rickon's wrists himself and tugged until the boy staggered forward, hands still bound but no longer tethered. Maester Wolkan fussed and fished in his satchel and produced a knife. Ramsay took it and cut Rickon's bonds, his fingers neat upon the knot as if it were something precious he worked at in his leisure, whittling memory to a point. The rope fell. Rickon rubbed each wrist automatically, his eyes cutting to John's and away again, as if the looking were made of something sharp. "Walk," Ramsay said, and flicked 2 fingers at Rickon, like a lord sending for wine. John swung down from his horse and passed the reins into Davos' hands. Sansa's hand gripped his forearm, her nails finding the leather through the wool. "If he cheats," she said. "Then we end him," John replied, so softly he barely heard his own voice. "Stay near the Vale Ridge. If he tries anything, show them. Make them come." Sansa's mouth thinned, but she nodded once. John touched the place where the pommel used to rest against his thigh and went forward into the only way through. He and Rickon walked the same line from 2 inhuman geometries, halves of a thing cut apart and pushed together in the field's center. The cold seemed to move away from him and then gather again, as if hesitant. He could feel Winterfell at his back even when his eyes were on his brother, the shape of it in his bones. When he had taken 3 steps, he heard the soft hiss of a bowstring drawn and did not let his head turn. Another step, and Ramsay laughed very softly, delighted with his own patience. At the weirwood, there stood no priest. None of them had ever had need of one. Between the beetle-smooth roots, John and Rickon faced each other. For a heartbeat, the world dropped away until there was only a boy's face. Rickon's mouth trembled. It turned stubborn. It tried to be brave and succeeded. "I'm here," John said with his eyes, the only language that would not be overheard. "I'm here. You're coming with me." He lifted his hands and turned his wrists outward. Davos had warned him. Blood beat against the skin there. He felt rather than saw Ramsay's fascination with the gesture. "Repeat after me." Sansa's voice rang, bright as iron rung on iron, carrying across the cold sheen of morning. She had moved now to where Vale banners could be seen if you knew where to look. 100 falcons on blue waited out of sight, their beaks tucked. "In the name of the old gods and the true." "The true," Ramsay called lazily. "Which are they? I lose track." Sansa ignored him and spoke to the men behind him instead, to the Umbers and the Karstarks, to the host of eyes watching from Winterfell's walls, to the small people in Wintertown who had crept to their doorways to see if new banners might hang by nightfall. "Repeat," she said, and her voice was a command no less than a plea. Wolkan shut his eyes and murmured it like a litany. John could feel even the giant shift like a restive mountain. Ramsay's lips moved. It was almost very funny. He had been trained to mimic what would keep him alive. He said it because the game was prettier that way. John put his wrists forward. Wolkan came between them with a length of chain as thin and fine as the chain around the maester's own throat, trembling so badly that he fumbled it twice. Ramsay at loss. T set it lightly himself through the rings and twisted until it caught. The sound of the closing link was very small. "Now," John said softly. He reached his hands out, the slack of chain between them tapping against his forearm, and put his palms on Rickon's shoulders. Rickon shivered, but his chin came up. John studied his face as if by looking he might memorize something not easily memorized. The exact shade of his eyes in winter light, the new weight at his jaw, the way he did not pull away even though the chain told him he ought to. "Go," Jon said aloud, for all to hear. "Go to her." Rickon nodded once and turned. He started to walk, then checked, glanced at Jon, and then, because he had been taught, made himself keep to a pace that was neither run nor crawl. It took 2 heartbeats for Ramsay to find the exact center of that, what it would mean to watch the boy walk away without flinching or flailing. Jon saw that calculation strike the inside of his eyes like sunlight striking glass. It made his smile into something worse than hunger. It made him reach very slowly for the bow one of his men was holding at his side. Davos' voice went very low. "If he draws." Before the sentence finished, a falcon banner lifted itself like a sheet shaken in a summer room. For an instant it was merely sky blue and white. Then it crested the ridge, and horse helms followed, metal noses shining. Men poured like water, and their sound came like the first slow roll of thunder. Sansa did not turn to watch them pour but kept staring at Ramsay, as if by the force of her eyes she might nail his hands open. Ramsay's fingers curved anyway. He put shaft to string, his head cocked, his tongue in the corner of his mouth. He drew. The veil thunder lifted again, and 1,000 bird mouths screamed as they descended. Jon had been waiting for this all through the morning's cold. He moved without thinking, as a man might breathe. He stepped between his brother and Ramsay and turned, presenting the smallest shape he could, chain clinking. Not to catch the arrow, that would be a child's bravado, but to change the geometry of Ramsay's pleasure. The bolt left the string. Davos shouted. Wolkan made a thin, keening sound like a kettle. One took 2 great steps that shook the ground and interposed his thigh. The arrow sank into meat. The giant looked down at it as if at an insect that had bitten him in a place he could not reach to scratch. Then he looked back at Ramsay, eyes gone old and tired and sad. "Break," Tormund said, already moving, because the game was over now, the rules cut apart by the first razor line of treachery. His axe rose, catching light. The Bolton men began to loose arrows without orders. Panic is an order all its own. The Umbers swore. Karstark shouted something that no one heard under the first crash of the Vale charge. Men who had come to witness put heels to horses and tried to get back to their lines and were caught between their bodies' knowledge, flee, and their bloods stand. It turned in a blink. It turned like the sky turning when you lay on your back and watched clouds run. Sansa lifted her gloved hand. The falcons came like rain driven sideways. Ramsay tossed his bow away and smiled at Jon as the chain tugged him forward. "Come, then," he said softly. "Come see your home." Jon did not answer. Davos cried out but could not reach him. The men around Ramsay were already moving in disorder. Ramsay pulled at Jon's chain, half dragging him like a boy who has gained a dog and is eager to show everyone he meets. Rickon was pulled by 2 men with shields towards the Vale line and delivered into Ser Davos' hands, who wrapped him in a cloak that felt like a tent and pushed him like a parcel towards Sansa. She made the far distance in 3 long, stumbling steps and took him, one hand to the back of his head, as if he were still small and might run if she did not anchor him. "You're safe," she said, but the sound that came out of her was not any word. It was a sound a woman makes when something returned to her had been believed forever gone. He could not hold her, not with his shoulders burning from where his arms had been pinned behind him for weeks, not with muscles remembering rope. But he pressed his face into her neck like he might learn again what his family smelled like, and Sansa swayed with it, like a single reed in a wind that was otherwise made entirely of steel. At the center, Ramsay dragged Jon the last few paces into motion and mounted up, wrenching the chain until Jon stumbled. The world whirled around them. Hoof thunder, metal meeting metal, one bellowing, the thud of earth shaking under men who would never tread it again. Jon found his feet and lifted his head. He told himself that this, too, was a path even if it looked only like a trap. He told himself that every trap looks like a path to the man who sets it. He tasted iron. He did not watch for an opening. He watched for a moment when the game became a different game. "Inside," Ramsay said cheerfully, hauling his horse's head about, dragging Jon like a catch on a winter morning when you bring a fish finally out of a hole cut for it. "Your father's hall." He turned his grin to the sky as if the old gods might be looking at him, to show them how clever he was. Winterfell's gates loomed. The Boltons had not expected the Vale charge. Their pike wall was forming ragged and too slow in the midfield. Where Karstark saw it, screamed and spurred, trying to knit men together with curses. The Umbers fell on the Falcon Knights with a howl that had nothing in it of joy, only rage and the old hatred for mail made pretty, for rule that wasn't of the winter and the hunt. Tormund met Small John Umber like an avalanche meets a boulder, and they slammed together with an impact that buckled knees on both sides. "Back!" a captain called at the gate. "Back inside." One's long strides ate ground. Arrows made a porcupine of him, and yet he ran. A shower of stones came arching down from the walls. Davos men raised shields and took what blows they could. Sansa looked once at Jon, seen briefly at the end of the chain like a sacrificial thing hauled towards a door. Then she looked away, because to watch would break her and nothing broken could command. "Lord Royce," she said tightly, "drive straight. Your men have weight. Use it." Lord Yon Royce nodded, his face all angles and old scars, and he opened his throat and shouted a house cry that rolled like rocks in a river. The gate rose before them. Jon stumbled into its shadow. Ramsay hauled him and laughed as if pulling a toy. Inside, the courtyard held a half-squad of men and frightened grooms. The kennels a dark stink down one side. The hall's doors yawning open with fire inside like a mouth. The world narrowed to wood and stone, and the sound of the bar thudding into place behind him as the gate slammed. Ramsay pulled Jon to the steps of the hall, then jerked him hard until he fell to his knees. "Look, dog," he murmured. "Home." He reached down and put 3 fingers under Jon's chin and lifted until Jon met his eyes. "I thought about how I would do it," he said. "I wrote letters about it. But the doing is always better than the thinking. It's a surprise even to me. You know what I like best? That you volunteered. It makes every line cleaner." Jon looked back at him and saw what he could not kill and what must be killed anyway. It would not be bravery to throw himself now. It would be a story Ramsay sipped at for weeks. Patience, he told himself. Davos had spoken to him of patience around small flames. You can turn a moment if you don't bite it before it opens its mouth. "Your men will not hold," Jon said. He said it the way you might remark upon a slight change in weather. "You made your battle on fear and not love. Fear breaks where it's thin. Love," Ramsay echoed, and laughed. "Look at you, whispering like a septa. The only love that matters here is your sister's for her brother. That is something I am going to use again and again until it is all gone." He stood and looked towards the gate, as if he could peer through stone to the plain outside. The smile softened, grew dreamy. "I starved the dogs this week. My father once told me such things wasted care. But oh, the joy of hunger when it obeys you." Jon felt a new cold, one made not of wind or ice but of the knowledge of what a man would do to remake the world in the shape of himself. He spoke to the air because he could not let his voice reach out of this place like a hand. "Sansa, do not come inside these walls yet. The field first. Break him there. Bring the bird knights to the shield line and smash it. Then bring the giant to the door. Make him feel you at his threshold. Outside, the battle moved as battles move when the pieces that thought themselves simple blocks of wood suddenly find they are carved men and mean to live. The Bolton line tried to reweave itself. The Vale smashed it where it was thin and pushed where it was only pulled together by shouted oaths. Small John and Tormund battered and tore. Smalljon's blade cut Tormund across the cheek. Tormund laughed all blood. Tormund got both hands into Smalljon's beard and dragged him forward and sank his teeth into the ear beneath it like a wolf making a point, and Smalljon roared. Old joy there for an instant, memory of feasts when pain was a joke told sought, and then drove his knee up into Tormund's belly and brought his sword down on Tormund's shoulder, so that the big man stumbled and would have fallen had not 3 wildlings leapt like crows around him, battering at Smalljon's legs and arms. A falcon knight took Smalljon across the back with a lance. The lance splintered and Smalljon turned and broke the helmet like a nut, then came again for Tormund. The air filled with steam of sweat and breath, the thud of bodies falling, the complaints of horses who had not been asked their opinions. Karstark's voice drifted like a curse across it all. "Hold! Hold! No one held but the stones. Sansa stood as still as a planted spear and watched for where to put weight. Rickon stood with Davos at her shoulder, wrapped in the cloak as if swimming, his eyes wide and fixed, his teeth clamped on his lip until it bled. "Breathe," Davos told him quietly. "That's all of wisdom. Breathe again." He looked at Sansa. "If we start to boil there by the center, pull the birdmen to the right. And no matter what, keep one wedge back. No one ever has one more wedge in this world when they need it." Sansa nodded. "And you, go to the archers. Make those men use their arrows when it makes men fall and not when it appeases their fear." Davos bowed, stiff and moved. He looked old on the field, but his voice did not. He carried. Men went where he pointed them. Somewhere in the turn of orders and the feel of the command, Sansa felt a sharp jolt of grief. Stannis camp in snow and fires that burned too near a child. Davos' eyes had not yet learned the thing they would learn by nightfall. She wished she could freeze the world before it did. One reached the gate and set his hands to it. The wood groaned. A dozen arrows made new mouths in him. He ignored all of them as if they were a summer's flies. He leaned his weight forward. The hinges wailed, metal complaining of the use for which it was not made. The beam that crossed the gate trembled like a tree in first wind. Men fell back from the inside. Some were thrown by the door's first inch of give as if it were a horse's kick. Ramsay looked up at the sound like a boy hearing a friend's knock. "How lovely," he breathed. He snapped his fingers to two guards, who dragged Jon to his feet and marched him, chain yanked in short vicious tugs, towards the kennels. The smell grew teeth. Jon had known the kennels since childhood. They had been warmth and noise, dogs that had licked him clean of snow and lay across his legs before fires. The door. His hand trembled. Something slipped into Jon's palm. It was so small and so sharp that it might have been a sliver of winter. Wolkan did not look at Jon again as he stood. He made himself go gray-faced and steady. Jon felt the smallness of the blade notch against his skin and understood. He stood very still while Ramsay whistled at the dogs and opened another door and then another. He made his palms damp with his own sweat, the better to hold the sliver. When the first dog came forward, belly low, tail stiff with hunger, its head weaving, Ramsay snapped his fingers and it froze, not out of love but of training that had been beaten into it. Jon slid the sliver into the first twist of chain at his left wrist and drew it against the iron, not to cut the link, impossible, but to search for the weakness in the leather that bound the bit to the chain. The guard holding the free length of chain was watching the dog. Jon's breath came deep and slow. He let his shoulders sag, as if fear had filled them with lead, and he felt the leather give a whisper. There. The gate boomed again. There. Outside, the battle's shape had changed. The Vale had swept one flank and folded it in. Karstark had thrown a reserve to stop the break and succeeded in stalling a slaughter but not in making it an advantage. Tormund and Small Jon had come to a knee fight. Tormund had lost his axe and seized Small Jon by the nose with a shout he would have used in bed, and Small Jon, startled, choked and then laughed, and then Tormund put a knee in his chest and rolled. Small Jon came up with a dagger and a smile that was almost gentle. It was an expression of regret for what he had to do to an enemy who had met him gladly. Tormund took the dagger in his forearm and bit Small Jon's throat. Clear light went out of the Umber's eyes slowly while he beat Tormund's back in a rhythm like rowing. He sagged at last, and the men around him made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a prayer. Davos archers found their work and loosed in controlled volleys that made gaps instead of noise. Sansa watched the gap widen at the right place and nodded and saw Lord Royce see her nod. His wedge lifted and moved, a pretty thing, and Sansa thought in a wave of nausea that this was not a game and also that you had to see it as one to move its pieces without dying of pity every minute. The gate finally broke. It did not explode outward and make a song of itself. It sagged and complained and then simply came down, with surrendering to weight with a series of rips that sounded like old cloth dying. One stepped through as if emerging from a river and stood blinking in the sudden shade. He bled from 20 places, his body a map of small red mouths. He put one hand to a post and it snapped under him like a thin bone. Inside the courtyard, Ramsay's head came up. He smiled, delighted. "Oh, I hoped," he said. "I hoped." He stepped back, lifted a spear from a rack, and cast it at the giant with startling grace. It thunked into one's shoulder. The giant did not even cry out. He reached instead for a rock and flung it towards Ramsay, because he was very old and very tired of pain. It missed Ramsay and broke a crate as if it had always wanted to be a shower of splinters. Jon used the giant's shadow. The sliver bit deep. The leather gave with a sigh. The chain dropped from his left wrist. He did not move the right yet. He let the loose length pool around his left hand as if still bound, and he took a single step towards Ramsay, who was watching the gate and smiling and calling something to the men on the wall that was probably meant to sound like reassurance. Jon could hear the shapes of words inside it. "Hold! More fire! My hounds!" He eased his right wrist against the edge, and that leather gave too, scraped raw by a man willing to give skin to get bone free. The chain fell with a sound that made two dogs' heads turn, and one guard looked directly at Jon's hands. Jon didn't flinch. He turned the chain slowly, wrapping it around his fist once, twice, and then he moved. He did not think. Thought is a sticky thing in a cloak. Davos took the first step into the yard and then knocked aside a spear and took a second. Sansa did not come in. She stood at the threshold and waited and watched. The waiting was the hardest thing she had ever done. Her body wanted to find Jon and hold his face between her hands as if that could reattach his life to his bones. She kept her hands on Rickon's shoulders instead. His breath shuddered under her palms. "Listen," she said in his ear, her voice steady, as if she were calling men to order at a council and not preventing herself from running herself blind. "When the doors are ours, we will go to the old god's wood. We will go first there. Your father taught you that." Rickon nodded, a small, vicious jerk that was so much like Robb's first nod when given a command that Sansa almost fell. In the courtyard, Ramsay came up from his stumble with blood in his eyes and joy on his mouth and swung. Jon caught the blow on the chain-wrapped fist and felt his own bones ring. He brought the chain back again and let it fall like a heavy whip. It cracked against Ramsay's cheek and brought more blood and a laugh. "I will put you in a room the size of a prayer," Ramsay said wonderfully evenly, as if making a wedding vow. "I will keep you there until you learn every word I put in your mouth. I will put your sister on the other side of that door and make you listen." Jon stopped hearing words. Some men have a place inside themselves where words go to be cut into small pieces once they are no longer useful. He hit Ramsay again and again, not with the chain's weight but with his fist inside it. Every blow a way to empty himself of air so that he could take in more. Ramsay went down. Jon followed him, put his knees on either side of his body, took handfuls of his coat and slammed his head against the frozen mud until the laugh was gone. He felt hands on his shoulders and knew they were not Ramsay's. He heard his own name like a sound a mother would make. He blinked. The world came back in with a rush of cold air and metal noise. "Jon," Sansa said from the yard's edge. Her voice had a weight to it that was not made of pleading. He looked up. Her face was calm. It had been made into a calm place by necessity, by fire and by unanswerable sounds in the night. "Stop," she said. "We need him alive for a moment." Jon stood as if someone else's hands had pushed him up. He looked down at Ramsay, who lay blinking against the gray sky, his eyes clearing like a man waking from a pleasant dream and trying to find his way back into it. Jon wanted to kill him. He wanted to kill him in a way that made wanting feel like a clean knife, simple, sharp, unornamented. He stepped back. Davos' men took Ramsay's arms and dragged him towards the cells. Jon could see they would need to use ropes. The dogs had made the lower rooms stink too much for any man to be put there if he meant to live long. The hall would suffice. It had doors and bars enough to turn anything into a prison. One staggered into the center of the yard and made a sound that Jon felt in his teeth. He sank to his knees. He had been a tower, a mountain, an old god walking. Now he was a man, and men go to their knees when they must. His head hung. Jon went to him and put his hand against the rough skin of the great forearm. "Thank you," he said. One looked at him and blinked, long, very slowly, as if trying to remember the shape of the word he'd once known for brother. In his eye lay something like a winter sunrise, a very small, very distant warmth. He made a sound that might have been Jon's name, or it might have been the name of another man long dead. He breathed in once, out once, and did not breathe again. The yard went quiet despite the chaos of men running for orders. Jon stood with his hand on skin that was cooling under it and lowered his head. They buried the giant at the edge of the godswood, because there was earth there soft enough to take him, and because it was the only place in Winterfell where snow seemed like a bless. Instead of a disguise for broken things. Jon stood too long beside that open grave and then turned away because the living pull upon you like ropes. Sansa took Rickon to the godswood first, as she had promised him. They stood beneath the heart tree the way they had stood when their father's voice was the roof over every day. She watched Rickon set his small hands against the skin of the tree. How carefully he did it, as if he was worried he might break it with the same fingers that had been bound only that morning. His mouth moved. If he had vowed something, he kept the words inside. When he finished, he turned and let himself fold into her like he had not done since he was very young. She held him, one arm around his shoulders, one hand at the back of his head. "You are here," she said. "It does not matter how long you were away. This is true." It was both a reassurance and a lie. Time weaves itself into men. You cannot pull it out again when you want to pretend it didn't happen. But she had decided, that morning, that certain lies were the only bridges they had. The truth could be a far-off shore if it had to be. They sat him by the fire in the hall and fed him carefully, as one feeds a man back to his life. Davos hovered without making it obvious that he was hovering. The habit of fatherhood did not leave you when sons did. Later, much later, when the crowds had been sent to wherever exhausted men sleep and the dead had been carried away to be named, Davos found the pyre outside, where the snow still held the black circle of burned wood, and found what he had not known to look for, the little stag he had carved for a bright child in a dark camp. He turned it over in his big hands and looked at the charcoal like it might bite him and said nothing to anyone. Not yet, because the night already had too many knives. Winterfell was theirs. Jon lay on a bed that had not been his since he had been a boy and stared at a ceiling he had not known he remembered. He could see where the panel showed a hunting scene, where a painter had made the deer too small for the dog that chased it. He lay very still and felt his body cataloging everything that hurt. Rib, forearm, the slash at his side. His hands knotted from chain. He slept. He woke with the memory of Ramsay's mouth shaped around speech. He slept again. In the morning, they brought Ramsay to the great hall in irons. It felt wrong to hold any court in that place while the air still smelled like another man's laughter and fear. But there was no other room roomy enough for all those who needed to see what was done. Sansa stood beside the high chair, not in the chair. She did not sit in it even when men behind her insisted with their eyes. Jon stood on her other side, not quite together, not quite apart. Rickon sat in a smaller chair because there had to be a throne somewhere for a boy with the name he had, and if you did not make one, some other man would. They did not let Ramsay speak long. He tried, of course. He tried to turn words into a whip and test the hall's skin. He had 100 tales of Jon's mother and 1,000 of what he would have done if only he'd been allowed to get hungry enough. He spoke of rights and banners and the order of war as if he had ever liked any order that did not come out of his own mouth. Sansa let him speak for 6 heartbeats and then raised her hand, and men whose bodies were already moving to silence him paused in their motion, uncertain if they were obeying a woman or a voice. "Enough," Sansa said, and it was a word that requires a lifetime to say properly. She had that lifetime now. "You killed your father. You killed your infant brother. You killed my little mother at the hands of your men." Her voice thickened, and she cleared it, forced it to ice again. "And you still cannot help but smile about it." He wanted to tell her that smiling was his prayer. He wanted to tell her that he made gods when he needed them and fed them dogs because nothing else ate as cleanly. He tried to open his mouth to say 100 vile things that had always worked before, had made women flinch and men pretend not to. But something had changed in the hall. He could not taste fear there anymore. He could taste only the thing that comes after fear when men have run out of it. He swallowed. Jon looked at Sansa. "He is yours," he said. His voice woke nothing but agreement in the room. She drew in a breath that seemed to fill her from ribs to throat. It had to be liked by no one but her. "Take him to his kennel," she said. Her eyes found Ramses and held them. "Let him learn that hunger obeys no one." The men obeyed her as if they had been doing it their whole lives. They dragged Ramsay toward the door, and he went with a smile like a challenge. Even now, he believed in himself the way a bad sword believes in the hand that holds it. It has cut enough to consider itself faithful. He thought even now that someone would spare him at the last moment because he had always managed to make them finish his stories for him. John did not go to the yard. He did not need to hear it. He had lived too close to the sound of men dying to gather more of it into himself than he needed. Sansa did go. Rickon slept at last under furs in a small chamber with curtains drawn. An old nurse sitting with him who had known their mother's voice and thus would not be moved by anyone else's. Sansa walked with an even tread to the kennel yard, where the air was sweet with hay and old wood and the stink of hunger gone sour. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her and watched as they tied Ramsay to the post at which he had tied so much else that had not deserved knots. He looked up at her and grinned. "No one leaves me," he said, as if this were the end of a riddle and not a life. Sansa tilted her head. "I did," she said. She turned away before the first door was opened. She did not watch men come to pieces. She had learned somewhere in the long road of it that justice did not require witnesses. Sometimes it required exactly the opposite. She stood in the yard and breathed steady in and out the way Davos had told her to tell Rickon to breathe, and it made a tight room in her lungs, but it kept the world from going too far to one side. Later, in the great hall, men argued about what to call John and what to call Rickon. Houses were careful about their words. The Mormont girls and women who had come with one boat and all the stubborn left in the bare island's bare trees stood with their small lady, who looked at men 20 times her age like they were boys and she their aunt. She crossed the room and planted herself in front of John like the little tree she was and said, clear as light, that the North remembered and that a man could be born without a name and earn it by the way he wore winter. It made a sound inside the hall like ice breaking. Men took up words and threw them in the air. King, Lord, Winterfell, North. John looked at Rickon, who sat watching it all with eyes still rimmed in red where old ropes had cut new tracks. He looked back at Sansa. She rarely let anything in her face now, but she let a small thing in then, a softening at the corner of the mouth that meant she could see how hard this would be and that she would stand through it anyway. "I will not take from him what is his," John said aloud, and the hall fell quiet with a rapidity that was alive. "He is Lord of Winterfell." He looked at Rickon again. "But I will stand where you ask me to stand. If there is to be a king at all, if that is to be a name we use again, it will not be a name that breaks my brother's house in half and calls that strength. It will be a name men say because it feels necessary when they think about what is coming when winter is not only a word." The room murmured. He sensed political engines being cranked in 5 different corners. He could feel Littlefinger's smile somewhere in that shadowed bank of watchers. He was certain Baelish had found a place to stand where the light touched his face just enough to look honest. John felt a headache coming on that had nothing to do with blows. He lifted a hand and the room made itself quiet for him again. He had not asked for the power to do that, but he would use it while he had it. "There are dead men walking," he said flatly. "There are kings in the snow that do not kneel, and there are children made of bones standing in forests you have not visited since your fathers were small. There is a night that will not break easily. If you call me anything, call me to that, not to a chair." Lyanna Mormont, child, stone, nodded once like a judge with a habit. "Then it is done," she said simply. "Lord Rickon of Winterfell, and the man we send to meet the cold when it knocks." It was of course not done. There were always a dozen small wars inside any victory, and they filled corners like rats. House Glover needed to be pulled back from shame and given something without making men angry who had given something already. The Umber's hats would be dusty for a generation. Karstark had died in the yard, and his son would need a choice of whether he wished to be a better tree than the one that had fallen. There were stores to count and a winter town to backfill with hope that did not sound like a lie. There were men to bury, kitchens to stock, wolves to feed. In the God's Wood that evening, Jon knelt at last where he had wanted to kneel the night before. He set his sword point down in the old snow that clung under leaves and let the cold creep through his skin into his bones. He said no prayers. He did not have words that would not sound like begging. He only listened. The leaves whispered, and the whispering held no answers he could translate. It did not matter. There are languages you only use to tell someone you are there and that you will not leave. Sansa came quietly and did not speak at first. She stood beside him and looked at the face in the tree and at their breath, which twined and broke and remade itself as it rose. "I told you I would not let him make you angry," she said at last in a voice that would do for truth. "I think I failed." Jon huffed something that was close enough to laughter that it made his lungs hurt. "You did not fail. I did not kill him on the field. I did not run when he made me run. I did not let the child die to make a song. That will have to be enough for a while." She glanced at him. "For a while." "You saved him," Jon said softly. "You saved us with your birds. I wish you had told me sooner. But I understand why you did not." "You understand because you do the same thing," she said, and her mouth turned. "You kept your plan in your chest until it beat you there. Do not do that again." She drew in breath. "I will try not to do that to you." They faced the tree together in the dimming. Snow began to fall again, not heavy, the kind that melts on cheeks and makes you think about what you did when you were small. "Father used to say winter is not an enemy," Sansa said. "It is a task." She looked toward the hall's roof line. "We have a task, brother." Jon nodded. He looked at his hands. He was more tired than he would let anyone see, and the tiredness was bone deep, not the kind a good night's sleep wipes away. But he had been tired before and done what needed doing anyway. "We will do it," he said. "Together." She reached out, and this time she put her hand against his, palm to palm, an old child's gesture they had grown out of too soon. He turned his hand and laced his fingers with hers a moment and then let go. The snow fell and made everything quiet, as if the gods had laid a finger to their lips to tell the world to hush while two Stark children made a plan. The days after came in pieces. The Vale Knights wanted to go home, and Littlefinger wanted something for the loan, and his price was always hidden inside of pleasantries and the cock of an eyebrow that told a story of how much better he had read the room than any of the rest of them. He stood with Sansa one morning on the parapet, the sky only half light and full of stinging flakes, and told her in a very level voice what he wanted. She said nothing for a long time, then said, "No," with such a calm ferocity that even he stared for a heartbeat at the word before remarking that there are different ways to count no's. And then he bowed like a good student and left to count again. Jon watched him go and wondered what shape the debt would take. He hated that you could not win a war without owing someone you despised. Davos went to Jon at dusk, the little stag in his hard hands. He set it down on the table between them and did not look at Jon's face at first. Jon looked at the wood and knew immediately what it was, and he knew too whom it had been given, and why, and by whose hand it had been made. The air grew very thin. Davos looked up. If there was any mercy in that rugged face, it was a mercy with a knife in it, clean. "I found it by the old fire," he said. "The one we made when we spoke of hope and winter and a king. There was a child," he said, and for once in all his trouble-fretted life, the words marched just as he wanted them to. "You know which one." Jon swallowed. "Ido." "I will speak to her in the morning," Davos said. "Not to ask for her head. To ask for the truth, the way a man asks the wind to tell him which way it means to blow. I am not a lord and do not understand all the games they play, but I know when something has been made wrong and then turned to ash and then lied about. That is a kind of winter I cannot live with." Jon nodded once. He was too weary to offer counsel and too honest to ask the old knight to stay his hand. The truth would come into Winterfell. It always did, no matter if the doors were shut. "Do what you must," he said. He told Rickon that night, in the simplest words he could, about the dead men in the snow and the walls of ice and the names for things no one in the South had believed in for hundreds of years. Rickon stared at him, the stubborn Stark already set like a line in his jaw. "We will fight them," he said fiercely. With swords. With fire, if we can manage it, Jon said, and put a hand over the boy's knuckles, which were white where he held the arm of the chair. With walls. With dragons, even if the world is as mad as it seems to be. With everything we have. He did not tell him that sometimes everything you have is not enough. He did not tell him that sometimes you get only the satisfaction of having held your ground until you dropped. He had decided not to tell children things like that unless they asked him specifically. It felt like a rule that might keep one thing safe in a world where rules had largely become decorations. In the weeks that followed, the hall of Winterfell filled again with the sound of men eating and arguing and mending harness. The kitchens became a place of sums and scoldings and new clever ways to make the same store of oats taste like 6 different dinners. Sansa walked with the old steward and learned how to ask for 5 eggs and be brought 4 and then smile and be brought the 5th without anyone feeling they had been reprimanded. Jon walked the walls and counted the crows and counted the days until the gods might decide whether the north would be given one more spring or whether the winter they deserved would keep its grip until the last small fire had eaten the last carefully hidden bit of tallow. Sometimes, at night, Jon woke with the feel of the chain in his palm and the flash of the little sliver in his thumb and forefinger that Wolkan had pressed there. Sometimes he woke with the picture of one's eye growing clouded. Sometimes he woke with a form taking shape in snow, the slat-ribbed horses of a dead king's dead army. He rose and went to the godswood every time. He put his hands on the same old bark and remembered the weight of vows that do not need words. He thought of the parley and how he had made himself a piece of it. It had been an ugly choice. Some choices so near ugliness that ugliness clings no matter how you wash. But Rickon slept 4 rooms away, breathing a boy's even breath. When Jon listened at that door and heard it, he knew the game had been worth playing. They gave one a stone with his name cut in the old speech and set it where the ground dips toward the heart tree so that Meltwater would visit it first. The day the stone was finished, Jon and Sansa and Rickon all laid a hand against it in turn, and the 3 hands were so different, scarred, soft, small, that Jon had to look away. It is an odd thing to be grateful to a dead man. It feels like asking something of him you cannot repay. They asked anyway. That was the thing about winter tasks. You asked and you worked and you did not dwell on the rightness of the asking. The North began to remember openly. Men came, some with their hats in their hands, some with their heads down because they had to decide whether to feel shame or relief more, and neither was easy. The Grachan's absence sat like an empty seat at every table. Small Jon lay under stone now, and his men wore their grief like cloaks that had to serve them for a while. Karstark's sons sent letters with stiff words and careful phrases. Sansa examined them with a face Jon learned to read. She would tell him without speaking whether a man told truth or feigned it. They made bargains. They made mistakes. They were young still, both of them, though their eyes had learned to lie. Sometimes, when there was an hour like a slice of fruit in a meal of meat, Sansa took Rickon to the walls and told him about Winterfell before it had become a story men told with winces in it. She talked of herbs in the kitchen garden, and the way the light made the hall bright in late afternoons in spring, and of the first time Arya had come home with a cut she had given herself with Edel, and how their father had tried not to smile and failed. Rickon listened like a boy at a window. He had been too small to have many of his own memories. He was making new ones on purpose now. He was stubborn about it the way the Stark line seems to be stubborn about weather and women and whether to rest. Jon went often to the yard where he had fought Ramsay under chain. He would stand where he had knelt and look at the stains that had been sleet and ash and blood, and were now only part of the ground again. He would look up at the kennels and then at the sky and remind himself quietly, in the old manner of naming each thing he loved as if the naming made a charm, what he had not become. There was a kind of justice that tasted like a meal for a starving man. He wanted someday to learn how to live on other food when it was offered. Winter came down more honestly then. The first real storm built itself slowly over 2 days, and the second came behind it like a younger brother trying to prove something. Men learned how to walk without slipping like they had never forgotten. Boys learned how to carry wood. Women learned again the perfect length to hold their skirts above the ground without sullying them and without freezing. The hall burned day and night. The old man who turned spits told stories because no one had told him to stop, and his stories were better than most. Jon stood to the side and let his mind be quiet when it could be. He watched Sansa speak to Lord Royce and not bend. He watched Rickon learn to parry with a wooden sword from a black-haired girl with a scar on her chin who looked at him as if he were a task and not a treasure, which was precisely what he needed. Once at dusk, when the snow was blue and the sky a fading bruise, Littlefinger found Jon on the wall and stood beside him without speaking long enough that Jon wondered if the silence were meant to be an insult or a gift. At last he said, "Your sister is strong." In that smooth voice that always had a joke in it, even when he was not laughing. Jon did not turn his head. "She always was," he said. "The world only gave her too few chances to show it." "Do you know what she wants?" Littlefinger asked. Jon considered. "A world where men come in through the doors and say what they mean and leave again without having taken anything not offered," he said. "I do not think you have ever visited such a room." Littlefinger's mouth shifted. "She wants her family safe. One day, perhaps even happy." He glanced at Jon's profile. Some small hunger there unquiet, a vulture circling. "And what do you want, Lord Snow? King? Lord? Brother? Bastard? What title suits you today?" Jon kept his eyes on the snowfield that had once been a killing ground. "To finish," he said. "To finish what I began before I knew it had begun." He turned his head then. "If you stand in that path, I will walk around you if I can." He let the words flatten. "If I cannot, I will walk through you." Littlefinger smiled, patient, the way an old thief smiles at a new lock. "Perhaps we will give each other many opportunities to practice our walking," he said. He took a step back and made a little bow and left Jon to the cold. At the next council, when men were tired enough that their tongues loosened as if they had each had one cup too many, Lord Serwyn stood and asked when the South would come for them, and Lord Wylus Manderly, who had made his way north at last with a fleet of small useless boats and one very good cook, laughed into his beard and said that the South is always coming for the North in some fashion, and that the trick was to make sure it got so lost on the way that it gave up. "There are others coming who do not lose their way," Jon said. He spread maps and showed men the shape of a thing that would not fit on a map. He made them see, as far as he could, the shape of the night. It was an old task to make men look at a danger they had never suffered. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes he did not. Sometimes he watched their eyes go dull and knew that no speech would make them bright again until the dead stood at their doors. That, too, was a winter task, to find a way to make men believe in cold while they were still warm. Sansa found him there late, the candles half burned to stumps, the maps abandoned and slumped like tired dogs. "Sleep," she said. "In a moment," he lied. She came closer and rested her hip against the table and looked down at the marks he had made with charcoal. "You cannot make men feel it when you want them to," she said. "You can only remind them of what they already feel and hope that it has not been numbed." He smiled without humor. "Is that wisdom you brought me from the Eyrie?" "It is wisdom I brought me from the road," she said, and her mouth made a small line. "From all the places men think nothing bad happens because the food tastes better than it does here, and because the walls are painted and the women are taught to answer questions with questions." She turned a piece of parchment with one finger. "There are two kinds of men who will learn about the dead in the snow. The kind who will need to see one before they believe, and the kind who will believe because you are the one standing in front of them. Choose your work accordingly." She looked at him. "You are good at this part. Let me do the other." He nodded, and it felt like the first step of a dance they had not been taught but which they could learn as they went, because their feet were their own and the tune, while strange, was a tune they both wanted to hum. That night, when the hall was mostly quiet, he walked alone to the yard where the parley had turned. Snow had covered the last of the marks. There was no trace of where he had knelt, where Ramsay had smiled, where the giant had fallen. He breathed. Somewhere in the south, a dragon queen was winding her way through cities he had never seen, and in the far north, a king was calling things from the Sear. X in the ice. In the in-between, there were brothers and sisters who had once believed they had no more family and now found that they had exactly enough to make a house stand. He stood and thought of the many meanings of the word parley. "It means to speak," It means to stand on a piece of ground you have agreed in your bones is safe and say to another man that some things are out of bounds even if everything else is at stake. He had forced a parley with a man who did not believe in them. He had made himself a rule and broken it at once. It had brought a boy back across a field and a giant to a gate and a winter night down upon a house. It had cost what it had cost. He was not sorry. He would never be sorry. He was simply tired in a way that could not be slept away. At the edge of the yard he turned and looked back, as if he might see ghosts in their proper places. His father at the gate, Robb leaning against a post, Bran on a barrel, Arya with needle, Sansa on the step with a needle of a different sort, Rickon tearing across the stones, the old gods of Winterfell watching with faces carved long and long ago. The yard held only snow and stone and the work of men with shovels. It was enough. He pulled his cloak tighter around him and walked into a house that was his not by law but by blood, which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes not, and he reminded himself, silently, which task comes first when winter is something more than weather. He did not expect thanks. He did not want thanks. He wanted time and men and a luck that did not always run out. He wanted those things for his family and his house and for the men who stood behind him thinking about their own. He wanted, very simply, for the next time he had to force a man to stand and speak to him, that the man would be the sort of man who understood what speaking meant. The snow continued to fall. The fires burned. Somewhere beyond where any of them could imagine, the night gathered like a robe on a line. Winterfell breathed, and with it the north. And in that breath, in and out, Jon felt the small, sufficient proof that life still stood and meant to answer the cold with something better than surrender. He heard a boy laugh in another room, Rickon's laugh now, not memory, and Sansa's low voice answering. He heard men cough, and boots thud, and the rattle of a pot. It was not much against what was coming. It was everything,